What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors sits down for what should be a simple interview, only to face 27 seconds of pure disrespect that would change everything? It only took one condescending comment from Joy Behar to ignite a confrontation so intense that producers had to pull the plug on live television. Before we dive into this unbelievable moment, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think about what you're about to hear. Samuel L. Jackson walked onto the View set that morning, expecting a routine promotional interview. He was there to discuss his latest film, nothing controversial, nothing political, just a seasoned professional doing his job. But Joy Behar had other plans. The interview started normally enough. The other hosts welcomed Jackson warmly, asking standard questions about his career and upcoming projects. Jackson, ever the professional, gave thoughtful answers, sharing insights about his craft and experiences in Hollywood. The audience was engaged, laughing at his stories, and clearly enjoying his presence. But then, Joy Behar decided to interject. "You know, Samuel," Behar said with that trademark smirk of hers, "I've always wondered something about actors like you." Jackson raised an eyebrow, sensing something off in her tone. "What's that, Joy?" "Well, you've made a career out of playing these tough guy roles, these angry characters. Do you ever worry that you're just reinforcing negative stereotypes?" The studio went quiet. The other hosts shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Jackson's expression remained calm, but you could see something flash in his eyes. "Excuse me?" Jackson said, his voice steady but with an edge. Behar pressed on, seemingly oblivious to the tension she was creating. "I mean, let's be honest here. You're always playing these intimidating roles. The angry man with a gun, the scary character who yells and curses. Don't you think that sends the wrong message?" Jackson leaned back in his chair, processing what he'd just heard. "Are you seriously asking me this question right now?" "I'm just saying," Behar continued, her voice taking on that patronizing tone she's famous for. "Maybe you could choose more positive roles, something more uplifting, more inspirational." "More inspirational?" Jackson repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Lady, do you have any idea what you're talking about?" The other hosts tried to jump in, sensing disaster approaching. "Maybe we should move on to," one of them started to say, but Behar cut her off. "No, I think this is an important conversation. Samuel, you have influence. You have power in Hollywood. Why not use it to show more positive images instead of all this violence and anger?" Jackson's jaw tightened. "You want to lecture me about my career choices? About the roles I pick?" "I'm not lecturing anyone," Behar shot back, her voice getting sharper. "I'm asking legitimate questions. You can't deny that many of your characters are problematic." "Problematic?" Jackson said, his voice now carrying that unmistakable edge that anyone familiar with his work would recognize. "You think my work is problematic?" The tension in the studio was thick enough to cut with a knife. Camera operators were getting nervous signals from producers off stage. The other hosts were practically holding their breath. Behar, however, seemed to be enjoying herself. "All I'm saying is that representation matters. And when young people see you constantly playing these aggressive roles, what kind of message does that send?" Jackson sat forward in his chair, his eyes locked on Behar. "Let me get this straight. You think I should only play characters that make you comfortable?" "That's not what I said," Behar replied, though her defensive tone suggested otherwise. "No, that's exactly what you said," Jackson fired back. "You want me to play nice, safe characters that don't challenge anyone or make anyone think too hard." "I want you to be more responsible," Behar said, her voice getting louder. "You have a platform. Use it better." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Jackson stared at her for a long moment, and you could practically see him deciding how to respond. "Responsible?" he said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. "You want to talk about responsibility?" "Yes," Behar said confidently, clearly not reading the room. "I think actors should think about the impact of their choices." Jackson nodded slowly. "Okay, let's talk about responsibility then." He turned to face her directly, his full attention now focused on the woman who had just questioned his entire career. "You know what's irresponsible, Joy? Sitting here on national television and reducing my 30-year career to some kind of stereotype." Behar opened her mouth to interrupt, but Jackson held up a hand. "No, you had your turn to talk. Now it's mine." The studio was dead silent. Even the audience seemed to sense that something significant was happening. "You want to know about my career? About the choices I make?" Jackson continued, his voice building in intensity. "I've played teachers, fathers, mentors, heroes, complex human beings with depth and nuance. But you reduce all of that to what? Angry black man with a gun?" Behar's confident smirk was beginning to fade. I never said anything about race. You didn't have to, Jackson replied sharply. Your implications were clear enough. The other hosts were now actively trying to intervene, sensing that this was spiraling out of control. But both Jackson and Behar seemed determined to have this confrontation. I think you're being overly sensitive, Behar said, and the moment those words left her mouth, you could see Jackson's expression change completely. The phrase that would trigger the explosion was about to be spoken, setting up the devastating exchange that would make television history. Overly sensitive? Jackson repeated, his voice dropping to that low, menacing tone that had made him famous in films like Pulp Fiction. Did you just call me overly sensitive? The temperature in the studio seemed to drop 10 degrees. Every person on that set knew they were witnessing something unprecedented. I'm just saying that maybe you're reading too much into my comments, Behar replied. But her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. She was starting to realize she might have pushed too far. Jackson leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. No, Joy. You don't get to walk that back now. You questioned my intelligence, my career choices, and my integrity. And now you want to tell me I'm being too sensitive about it? Look, Samuel, I think we're getting off track here. One of the other hosts tried to interject, desperate to defuse the situation, but Jackson wasn't having it. No, we're not getting off track. We're finally getting to the point. Joy here thinks she can sit behind this table and lecture me about how I should live my life and conduct my career. Behar's jaw tightened. She clearly didn't like being called out so directly. I have every right to ask questions. That's what we do here. Questions? Jackson laughed, but there was no humor in it. Those weren't questions, Joy. That was you trying to put me in a box, trying to make me into some kind of problem that needs fixing. I never said you were a problem, Behar shot back, her defensive instincts kicking in. You didn't have to say it, Jackson replied. Your whole attitude, your tone, your condescending little smirks. You've been treating me like I'm some kind of charity case from the moment I sat down. The other hosts were frantically trying to signal the producers. This was going way beyond a normal heated discussion. This was personal now. But Behar, in what would prove to be a catastrophic decision, decided to double down. I think you're overreacting, she said, her voice taking on that dismissive tone again. All I did was ask some simple questions about your career. Jackson's eyes widened. Overreacting? Simple questions? He stood up from his chair, and the entire studio tensed. Let me tell you something about your simple questions, Joy. When you sit there and suggest that my career is somehow harmful, that's not a simple question. When you imply that I'm irresponsible for the roles I choose, that's not a simple question. Behar remained seated, but her posture had shifted. She was no longer leaning forward aggressively. She was sitting back, suddenly aware that she might be in over her head. You want to know what's really irresponsible? Jackson continued, his voice building to that powerful crescendo that had captivated audiences for decades. It's sitting here with millions of people watching and making assumptions about someone's character based on the movies they've been in. I wasn't making assumptions, Behar protested weakly. Yes, you were, Jackson fired back immediately. You looked at me and saw nothing but the characters I've played. You didn't see the man who's been married to the same woman for over 40 years. You didn't see the man who's put countless young actors under his wing and helped them navigate this industry. You didn't see the man who's donated millions to charity and worked tirelessly for social causes. The studio was dead silent. Even the camera operators had stopped moving. All you saw was what you wanted to see, Jackson continued, his voice now filled with genuine hurt and anger. A stereotype that you could lecture and fix. Behar opened her mouth to respond, but Jackson wasn't finished. And you know what the worst part is? You think you're being progressive. You think you're helping by trying to police my career choices, but what you're really doing is trying to control how I express myself as an artist. That's not true, Behar said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Jackson challenged. You want me to play safer roles, more positive characters, characters that make you comfortable, characters that don't challenge your preconceptions or make you think too hard about difficult subjects. He began pacing slightly, his hands gesturing as he spoke. Do you have any idea how insulting that is? To have someone tell you that your life's work, your artistic expression, is somehow wrong because it doesn't fit their narrow view of what you should be doing? The other hosts had given up trying to intervene. They were watching this unfold like everyone else, mesmerized by the raw emotion and intelligence Jackson was displaying. I've spent 3 decades building a career, Jackson said, turning back to face Behar directly. 3 decades choosing roles that interest me, that challenge me, that tell important stories. And you think you can sum all of that up as problematic? Behar was now visibly uncomfortable, shifting in her seat and glancing around as if looking for help. I think you're taking this too personally. Those words hit Jackson like a slap in the face. Too personally? My career is personal, Joy. My art is personal. When you attack that, you're attacking me. I wasn't attacking anything, Behar said, but her voice was getting smaller. Yes, you were, Jackson replied firmly, and the fact that you can't even see it makes it worse. You're so comfortable in your position of privilege that you don't even realize when you're being disrespectful. The word privilege seemed to hit a nerve with Behar. Her defensive walls went up immediately. Privilege? What privilege? Jackson looked at her with something approaching disbelief. The privilege of sitting behind that desk and thinking you can judge other people's life choices. The privilege of believing your opinion about my career matters more than the decades of work I've put in. I have a right to my opinion, Behar said, her voice getting sharper again. You have a right to your opinion, Jackson agreed. But you don't have the right to be disrespectful. You don't have the right to reduce my work to stereotypes. And you certainly don't have the right to lecture me about responsibility when you clearly don't understand the first thing about what I do. The confrontation was reaching its boiling point. Both participants were now fully committed to this battle, and it was clear that neither was going to back down easily. The next exchange would prove to be the moment that crossed the line completely. Behar's face was now flushed with anger and embarrassment. She had clearly not expected this level of pushback from her guest, and her composure was cracking under the pressure of Jackson's relentless logic. You know what? Behar said, her voice taking on a bitter edge. Maybe the problem isn't your roles. Maybe the problem is your attitude. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Jackson froze, staring at her with an expression of complete disbelief. My attitude? He said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. Yes, your attitude, Behar repeated, seemingly unaware that she was about to detonate a nuclear bomb. You come in here acting like you're above criticism. Like nobody has the right to question anything you do. Jackson's hands slowly clenched into fists at his sides. You think I have an attitude problem? I think you have a problem with authority? Behar shot back, her own anger now fully unleashed. I think you don't like being questioned by people who don't worship the ground you walk on. The other hosts were now actively signaling for commercial break, for anything to stop this runaway train. But it was too late. The damage was done. Jackson looked at Behar for a long moment, then began to laugh. But it wasn't a pleasant laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes before something terrible happens. Authority? He said, still chuckling. You think you represent authority here? I represent the voice of the audience. Behar replied haughtily. I ask the questions that need to be asked. No, Joy, Jackson said, his laughter stopping abruptly. You represent everything that's wrong with this business. You represent the entitled, self-righteous attitude that thinks it can tear down other people's accomplishments because it makes you feel important. Behar's mouth fell open. She clearly hadn't expected such a direct attack. How dare you, she sputtered. I've been in this business for decades. I've earned my place at this table. Have you? Jackson asked, tilting his head. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've earned your place by being controversial, not by being good at what you do. The insult hit its mark. Behar's face turned red with fury. You arrogant piece of work! Who do you think you are? I know exactly who I am, Jackson replied calmly. I'm someone who's earned respect through talent, hard work, and dedication, not someone who got famous by running their mouth and tearing other people down. That was the final straw for Behar. She shot up from her chair, pointing an accusatory finger at Jackson. You think you're so much better than everyone else, don't you? She yelled. You think because you're some big movie star, you can come in here and disrespect me on my own show? Jackson remained perfectly calm in the face of her outburst. Your show? I thought this was The View, not the Joy Behar Hour. The other host winced at the cutting remark. Jackson had just pointed out something that Behar clearly struggled with, her need to dominate every conversation. This is my workplace, Behar screamed, completely losing her composure now. And I don't have to sit here and take this abuse from some has-been actor who thinks he's too good for honest questions. The studio gasped. Even by Behar's standards, calling Samuel L. Jackson a has-been was incredibly out of line. Jackson's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped to that deadly whisper that sent chills through everyone present. Has-been? He said quietly. Did you just call me a has-been? Behar realized immediately that she had gone too far, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. If the shoe fits, she said weakly. Jackson nodded slowly, as if processing this information. Then he turned to address the camera directly, speaking to the audience at home. Ladies and gentlemen, he said in that perfectly controlled voice. You just witnessed something remarkable. You watched someone reveal their true character on live television. He turned back to Behar, who was now standing behind her chair as if using it as a shield. You want to call me a has-been? Let's talk about careers, Joy. Let's talk about legacy. I've made over 150 films. I've worked with every major director in Hollywood. I've brought complex, meaningful characters to life for 3 decades. His voice began to rise, building to that powerful crescendo that had made him legendary. And what have you done? What's your contribution to the world? Sitting behind a desk, tearing down people who actually create something, who actually contribute to the culture? Behar tried to interrupt, but Jackson was just getting started. You want to lecture me about responsibility? About the message I send? What message do you send, Joy? What do you contribute to society besides negativity and division? The producers were now frantically signaling to cut to commercial, but Jackson wasn't finished. I came here today to talk about my work, to share something positive with your audience. But instead, I got lectured by someone who thinks controversy is the same thing as relevance. He began walking toward the edge of the stage, clearly preparing to leave. You know what's really sad, Joy? You had a chance to have a real conversation with someone who's lived an interesting life, who's got stories to tell and insights to share, but you were too busy trying to score cheap points to actually listen. Behar, perhaps realizing the magnitude of her mistake, tried one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Samuel, wait, she called out. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot. Why don't we start over? Jackson stopped and turned back to her, a look of pure disdain on his face. Start over? He repeated. Lady, there's no starting over from what just happened here. You showed everyone exactly who you are today. He looked directly into the main camera one final time. To anyone watching at home, remember this moment. Remember what happens when ego gets in the way of basic human decency. And remember that respect is earned, not demanded. With that, Samuel L. Jackson walked off the View stage, leaving behind a stunned studio and one of the most explosive television moments in recent memory. The camera lingered on Behar's shocked face as the show finally, mercifully, cut to commercial. The confrontation was over, but the impact would be felt for years to come. In just under 30 minutes, viewers had witnessed the complete dismantling of a television host's credibility by one of Hollywood's most respected actors. It was a masterclass in how to handle disrespect with dignity, intelligence, and devastating effectiveness.